The afternoon stage came down out of the high sage like a thing that had been beaten the whole way, swaying on its thoroughbraces, the 4 horses lathered gray to the shoulder. And when it stopped in front of the Coldwater Forks land office, the dust it had been dragging behind it for 9 miles caught up and rolled on past, over the loafers on the mercantile porch, over the new painted sign, over the woman who stepped down into it without flinching. She came out backward, the careful way a person comes who has done it many times alone, one boot finding the iron step and then the rutted street, and she straightened up into the light and stood there a moment, letting the country settle around her, a worn carpet bag hanging from her left hand and held tight against her ribs with her right arm the way another woman might hold a sleeping child, a small black tin box, japanned and cornered in dull brass, with a lock on the front of it no bigger than a thumbnail. She was 32 and looked it, plain in the face and plainly dressed. A gray traveling dress gone shiny at the cuffs, brown hair drawn back so tight it pulled at the corners of her eyes, and those eyes were the only quick thing about her. They moved once down the street and took the whole of it in and gave none of it back. The street was the town entire. There was the bank at the head of it, brick-fronted and grand the way a banker builds a thing to be looked at, with Coldwater Forks Savings in gold-shadowed letters across the glass, and below it a mercantile, a livery with the wide doors thrown open on a cool dark smelling of hay and horse. A saloon called the Antelope, leaning its false front into the wind, and the land office itself, smallest of the lot and newest painted, a clean white among the weathered gray of everything around it, so that a person who read country the way some people read print would have looked at that fresh paint and wondered, idly, who in a dying district had money to spend making a land office pretty. She did wonder. She filed it where she filed things, and let her face stay shut. On the mercantile porch 4 or 5 men sat the afternoon out in the patient way of men with no work, and among them, on a stool dragged out from the counter, sat the storekeeper's wife, Agatha Pell, a broad, soft woman with a face built for verdicts. She had been watching the stage road since the dust first showed, and she had her opinion ready before the wheels stopped turning. "Well," Agatha said, not low, "there she is, then. There's what he sent off for." She let it carry. "Hartwell's bride." She said the word bride the way another woman would say the word stray. "Look at her." "I told Pell. I said the day a man advertises in a paper for a wife is the day you know he's scraped the bottom of the barrel and found a hole in it. And here she comes. Past 30 if she's a day, and got up like a Sunday school teacher gone to seed." A loafer chuckled obligingly. Agatha warmed, "No, you mark me, that one couldn't catch a husband the honest way, in a town where folks could see her, so she's gone and got herself ordered out to a sheep man too poor and too sorry to ask twice. Old maid charity, the both of them. Lord knows what she's running from." The woman in the street turned her head. She did not speak, and she did not hurry, and there was nothing in it that a person could have pointed to afterward and called rude. She simply turned and put her eyes on the one man who had laughed, a lean cowhand leaning on the porch rail with a grin half-formed, and she held them there. She held them there past the moment when a glance is a glance, and into the place where it becomes a question. And the question her tired, steady eyes asked, without a word in it, was, "And what is it you've made of your life, that you've the leisure to sit and price mine?" The grin came apart on the man's face. He looked at his boots. He found something on the rail to pick at. Agatha Pell's mouth, which had opened to go on, stayed open a beat too long and then closed, and the porch was quieter than it had been, and the woman let it be quiet exactly as long as she chose to, and then turned away, unhurried, as if she had merely been counting them. She was not timid. People kept mistaking the stillness in her for timidity, because they had never been tired the particular way she was tired, which was the tiredness of a person who has buried the one thing she loved and carried what was left a very long way alone, and learned that there is nothing left in the world worth being afraid of a porch full of idle men over. It was into that quiet that Caleb Hartwell came. He came up the street from the livery on foot, and he came the way a man walks toward a thing he dreads but has decided to do. Not slow, exactly, but with no eagerness in it anywhere, his boots placing themselves like he was paying for each step out of a thin purse. He was mid-30s and looked older in the way that hard sun and hard years stack onto a man's face faster than the calendar allows. Raw-boned, big through the shoulder but gone a little spare, with a few days of dark beard he hadn't troubled with, and a mended coat. She saw the mending first thing. A neat patch at the elbow done by a hand that was no longer in the world to do it again. And under the brim of a sweated hat, a pair of washed-out gray eyes, the precise color of the sky out here in the dead middle of a dry afternoon. Eyes that had once hoped for things and had been talked out of it. He stopped a careful arm's length from her. He looked at the carpet bag and the tin box, and last of all at her face, and what was in his look was not unkindness. It was a kind of apology he didn't have the words for and wouldn't have spent them if he had. "You'd be the Calder woman," he said. It was flat. It was a man reading a brand to be sure he had the right animal before he turned it into his string. "Ruth Calder," she said. Her voice was low and even and carried no farther than it needed to. She let a small space go by. "I figured you'd be friendlier." Behind her, on the porch, somebody laughed. A short bark, quickly bit off. Caleb's jaw moved, the muscle in it standing out and settling, and for a second the gray eyes had something live in them. Something that might have been anger or might have been shame at being caught out playing in front of his town, and then it went under again the way everything in him seemed to go under. And he didn't rise to it, and he didn't apologize. He just stood there, having been told the truth. "I reckon I'm out of practice," he said at last, which was as near as he was going to come, and she heard the honesty in it and gave him a small nod for it, the way you'd nod at a man who'd at least owned a thing instead of lying. He reached for the carpet-bag. She let it go into his hand without a word, and that was its own small message, that she would be handed nothing, and would also not make a show of refusing help, that she meant to do this thing like a partnership and not a war. But when, having the bag, he put out his other hand toward the tin box, not grabbing, just a tired man's reflex to carry both, to get it over with, to get her loaded and the street behind them, she turned. She didn't pull it back. She didn't clutch it or step away or do any of the things that would have told him it mattered. She simply turned, smooth and slow on the ball of her foot, a half-quarter of a turn that put her shoulder between his hand and the box, as natural as a person turning to look at something down the street, so that his fingers closed on nothing but air, and the box stayed where it had ridden the whole 9 miles, against her ribs, over her heart. "I'll keep this one," she said. That was all. No edge to it. And Caleb Hartwell looked at the little black box for a long moment, japanned and brass-cornered and locked, and then he looked at her face, which told him exactly nothing, and she watched him do the arithmetic that a tired man does, watched him weigh the cost of asking against the cost of the long ride and the longer season ahead, and decide, the way a man decides to leave one more chore for tomorrow, that he did not have the strength to spend on her secrets today. Maybe never. There was something in the set of him that said he had quit asking the world questions a while back, on account of he didn't care for the answers it kept handing him. "Suit yourself," he said, and turned toward the buckboard. The ride out was long, and it was mostly silent, and it was, for Ruth Calder, the richest hour she'd had in months. Though no one watching her flat plane profile against the going gold light would have guessed it. Caleb drove with the reins loose in his big hands and his eyes on nothing, and said 3 words the first 4 miles. She let him. She was reading. This was the gift her father had given her, the one nobody could take and nobody so far had thought to look for under the gray dress and the tight-pulled hair. She could read country the way Agatha Pell read a stranger. Only she read it true. Elias Calder had set her on the seat of a buckboard before she could properly walk and taught her the whole long sentence of the land. And she read it now, mile on mile, and what it told her was not the simple thing Caleb plainly believed, which was that he lived on a doomed and dying place. The sage was overgrazed. She saw that, saw it cropped to the woody stem in great patches and the bare ground showing pale between. The unmistakable mark of too many animals held too long on a range with no plan to it. But the soil under the ruin was sound. The grass that was left was the right grass. And the country wasn't dead. It was only tired and ill-used, the way a good horse can be ridden down by a poor rider and come back to itself entirely under a better one. They crossed a creek that should by the look of its cut banks have run a horse belly deep in spring, and ran now in a thin brown thread you could step over, and she marked the place a 1/4 mile up where the willows stayed green even so, and stored it. They passed a windmill standing skeletal against the sky, with one vane sprung loose and clattering, pumping nothing. Short of water, she thought, not short of land. There is a difference, and you have died for not knowing it. And then, where the road bent along the foot of a long, low rise on the back stretch of the country, she saw the ledge. It came up out of a draw, a spine of broken gray rock shouldering through the thin soil, gone to rubble and rotten looking along its near face, where somebody years back had dug at it and quit. She could see the old workings, the caved adit, the gray waste rock thrown out in a fan and grown over with nothing. To Caleb it was an eyesore on land already cursed, and he jerked his chin at it without slowing the team, and for the first time the whole ride there was feeling in his voice, and the feeling was contempt. The bad acres, he said. Backtracked. Nothing'll graze it, never has, nothing'll grow on it. Some silver outfit dug there before my time, made a noise about it, and found out what everybody else already knew. It's played out, was played out before they got there. Broke ground and broke rock, and not a dime in any of it. He spat over the wheel. Man back east holds paper on better land than that and can't give it away. It's the worst of a bad lot. I'd deed it to the wind if the wind would take the taxes too. Ruth Calder said nothing. But her eyes, which had been moving steady and easy over the whole country all the long ride, caught on that gray rock and stopped. And inside the stillness of her face, something went still in a different way. The way a hawk goes still the instant before it stoops. Because she was looking at the float, the broken bits washed and tumbled down the draw from the ledge above, scattered along the road cut where the buckboard wheels had ground over them for years. And even in the going light, even at the trot of the team, she could see the color in it. She could see the particular dull blue-gray heaviness of the stuff, the look of galena gone weathered, and a fleck here and there of something brighter caught where the rock had cracked fresh. She knew that color the way she knew her own name. She had stood at her father's elbow and watched him crush rock that color and roast it and run it down through the fire assay and read off the little bright bead of what it carried. And she knew, with the cold, certain knowledge of a thing learned in the bone and not the head, that the man beside her had just told her his most worthless acre and pointed her straight at a fortune. She kept her breath even by main strength. She turned her face a little away, toward the dimming country on the other side and let nothing show. It was not time. It would not be time for a long while yet, and might never be time at all. And she had learned, she had learned what it cost to tell the wrong man a thing like this too soon. The ranch came up in the last of the light, a gray timber house squatting low against the rise, a barn, a shearing shed with its long roof sagging at the ridge like a sway-backed horse, a set of lambing pens off to the side, and beyond them, dim in the dusk, a thin, scattered band of sheep moving slow toward the fold with a dog working the edges of them. A smear of wood smoke stood up from the chimney and bent off flat in the evening wind. It was a poor place and an honest one, and it had been, she could see, loved once and was now only endured. And the difference showed in 100 small things half finished, gates wired shut that wanted a hinge, a flower bed by the door gone to weed. A child stood in the lit doorway. She was about 7, dark-haired, thin, dressed clean in a dress she was a little too tall for. And she did not run out the way a child runs to a returning father. She stood in the doorway with one hand on the frame and watched the buckboard come. And her face was grave and old past its years and wary as a wild thing. And when the wagon stopped and she saw the woman on the seat, her eyes went to Ruth and stayed, measuring, giving, nothing. Just inside the door, on a low peg set at exactly a small child's height, hung a coat, a woman's coat, plain and dark and worn soft, hung where a hand half the size of a grown one could reach it. And Ruth saw Caleb's eyes go to that coat for half a second as he climbed down, and flinch and slide away from it, and she understood the whole shape of the house in that one flinch, the way you can read a whole winter in a single ring of a cut tree. Somebody had hung that coat there. Somebody small reached up and touched it still. "This is Sorrel," Caleb said, and his voice when he said the child's name was the only soft thing she'd heard out of him all day. She was Mira's girl. My wife's. He stopped on the word wife, like a man stepping wrong on a sore foot. Mira, she passed last winter. The fever. He did not say more. There was not, his face said, any more that words would do. Sorrel, Ruth said, and gave the child a plain nod, woman to woman, not bending down into the false bright voice grown people use on children. And she saw the girl note that and weigh it and not yet decide. An old man came around from the fold leaning on a crook, stooped and slow, with a face seamed brown as a saddle and faded kind eyes and a hand short 2 fingers. And he took his hat clear off when he saw her on the seat, took it off and held it against his chest and said, "Ma'am," like she was somebody. And it was the first plain decency anyone had shown her since the stage rolled into Coldwater Forks that afternoon, and something in her that had been braced all day eased the smallest fraction at it. "Jonas Quick," Caleb said. "Herds for me. Has since before me." And the dog came up out of the dusk at the old man's heel, a rough black and white sheepdog with one ear up and one down, and it walked straight past Caleb and past Jonas, and came to Ruth where she stood down off the wagon now, and put its weight against her skirts, and leaned there, looking up, and she put her cool hand down on its head without thinking. "Well," said Jonas, watching, and there was something near a smile working in the seams of his face. "That there's Shep. He don't lean on just anybody. I've come to set considerable store by what that dog thinks of a person, ma'am, more'n I do by most that can talk. Supper she made herself, out of a larder so thin it shamed the house, and made it fine. She found flour and saleratus and a little salt pork, and the last of a sack of beans, and she made biscuits that came up light, and a gravy with some color to it, and she fried the pork crisp, and she set it down on the bare table in front of the man and the child without remark. Caleb ate the first bite like a man bracing for the worst. And then he stopped and looked at his plate and ate the rest of it slow and said not one word about it. And she watched him not say it and understood from the way Sorrel watched her father's face that this silence was, from Caleb Hartwell, the highest praise there was, that the man had been comforted by food in his own house for the first time in a long while and did not have anywhere left in him to put the feeling, so he just ate. And the not saying was the saying. He told her the terms that night on the porch, after the child was aped, with the cold spring stars coming hard and white over the rise and the wind moving in the sage. He told them flat, looking out at the dark and not at her, like a man reading off a thing he'd rehearsed so he wouldn't lose his nerve. There was a room off the kitchen, he said, that had been the wife's sewing room, and it had a bed in it now, and that was hers. He'd not pretend it was anything other than what it was. He'd sent for a hand he could call a wife so the town would let it lie, and so there'd be somebody to keep the house and help him shear and lamb and get through this one last season, and that was the whole of it, and he'd be square with her about it because she'd come a long way on his word and deserved that much. He was not. He said, and here the flat voice caught, just slightly, just once, he was not in any condition to be a husband to anyone. Hadn't been since Mira. Wasn't sure he'd ever be again, and wouldn't lie and say he would to make it easier. It was a working arrangement. She should know that going in. Ruth listened to the whole of it without once interrupting, her hands folded in her lap, and when he was done she let the wind have a moment, and then she said, "Quiet. I'd rather a hard truth told plain than a kind lie told soft. I've had my fill of the other. You've dealt square with me, Mr. Hartwell, and I'll deal square with you." And that was all, and he looked at her then, sidelong, surprised maybe to be answered like a person and not a problem, and gave a short nod, and they sat a while longer with nothing more needing to be said. Two tired people on a poor porch under a great cold sky, strangers, married. She took the lamp into the dead woman's room. There was still a basket of someone's mending in the corner, and a thimble on the sill, and she did not move them. She opened the trunk at the foot of the bed and laid her few dresses in over the top of her other things. And at the very bottom, wrapped in a flannel petticoat where no idle hand would come on it, she set the locked tin box, and she stood a moment with her hand flat on the lid before she covered it over. Inside it was a notebook, a field notebook. Cheap pasteboard covers, gone soft at the corners with handling. Filled cover to cover in a small, precise hand she would have known among 10,000, her father's hand. Elias Calder's, territorial assayer and surveyor, dead 2 winters now on a lonely stretch of trail that the men who paid for it had been careful to make look like an accident. In that notebook, in his neat figures and his careful little drawings, was the survey of a ledge he had been hired to write off as worthless, and had instead found to be the richest silver lead vein in the district. A true vein the first played-out outfit had quit on just short of the money, recorded and sampled and assayed and ready to file honest. And he had been killed for it before the ink was dry, killed by the combine that wanted the ground for nothing, and meant to take it through a crooked land office once the poor fools who lived on top of it could be, got to sign their worthless rock away. She had taken the notebook and run. She had run west and gone to ground and made herself small and answered an advertisement in a paper, because a married woman in a far district was the hardest kind of person in the world to find. And by the long, blind arithmetic of grief and flight, she had stepped off a stage and ridden 9 miles into the dusk and come. of all the ranches in all the territory, to the very gray ledge her father had died over. The same back acres, the same broken bad luck rock, the same fortune in the ground, and she had not known it until the buckboard wheels ground over the float in the road, and the color stopped her heart. She lay in the dead woman's bed with the lamp out and her eyes wide open on the dark. And she thought about that. And she thought about her father. And she thought about the smiling outside money that had painted a land office white in a dying town. And she made herself a promise that there would be a right time to tell the gray, faithful man asleep across the house the whole of it. And that this was not it. Not yet. Not until she was sure to the bottom of her bones that the truth would be safe in his hands. Far off down the draw, where the wind came off the bad acres, the broken ledge held its silver in the dark and gave no sign. And somewhere in town, a man in fine clothes, who had never once looked Ruth Calder in the face, was waiting, patient as a spider, for one more beaten homesteader to sign. She was up while the windows were still black. Caleb woke to a thing he had not woken to in a year and more. The smell of coffee already made, the soft iron clatter of a stove lid set back in its place, the sound of a woman moving in his kitchen with no waste in any step she took. He lay a moment in the cold dark and listened to it the way a man listens to weather, trying to tell what it meant for him, whether it was a kindness that would be paid for later, the way kindness mostly was. Then he pulled on his boots and went out, and there was the fire going and biscuits already in the bake oven, and Ruth standing at the board in the gray light with her sleeves turned back and flour to her wrists. And she did not say good morning the way Mira used to, all soft and asking. She said, "There's coffee," and went on with what her hands were doing, and the not asking of it was somehow the first easy thing that had happened in that house since the burying. He poured himself a cup and stood by the door drinking it and watched her over the rim, suspicious in the bone-deep way of a man who has learned that the world hands you nothing it does not mean to take back with interest, and she let him watch and was not troubled by it, and that troubled him more than anything. She did not ask him for soft things. She asked him for the books. After the first breakfast, with Cyril still asleep and Jonas not yet up from the bunk in the shed, Ruth dried her hands and said, plain as asking for the salt, "I'd want to see the papers. Mr. Hartwell, the deed, and whatever the bank sent you, and any ledger you keep." He looked at her a while. A man did not hand the inside of his ruin to a woman come 3 days off a stage, but he was tired, and there was a flatness in her that did not look like prying. It looked like a doctor asking where it hurt, and after a minute he went and got the cracked ledger down off the shelf over the mantel where it had sat gathering soot, and a cigar box with the bank's letters in it, and he set them both on the table in front of her, and stood back with his arms folded as if he'd handed over a wound. She read the way her father had taught her to read, which was to say she did not read for the words a man wanted you to take from a page, but for the bones underneath them. She turned the ledger leaves slow. She ran a clean column of figures down the margin of a feed sack paper in a pencil she'd brought of her own, and she did it without a word for the better part of an hour, while the light came up yellow through the dirty glass, and Cyril got up and was given a biscuit and butter and sent out to mind the dog. And what Ruth saw, building under her pencil, was not the picture Caleb carried in his own head. Caleb believed himself a failed man on failing ground, a man whose whole place was rotten clear through and only waiting to be carted off. But the ground was not rotten. The range was overgrazed and dry, but range came back. She had grown up among men who knew how to read a country, and this one had been used hard, not killed. The creek was down, but the country had water in it if a man knew where to rest it and where to look. The flock was thin, but it was not sick. The wool in the shed was long and bright and sound, good clip, the kind buyers fought over in a fat year. There was nothing the matter with the land or the sheep that one good season and a little sense would not mend. What was killing Caleb Hartwell was the paper. It was all in the cigar box. There was a note held by the Coldwater Forks Bank. She found the original of it folded soft as cloth from being read so often. Taken 3 years back in a green year against the dry ones nobody had seen coming. And it had come due, called in full, with the bank's own Mr. Silas Rue writing letter after letter in a hand as round and pleasant as his face was said to be, each one regretting more sweetly than the last that the institution simply could not extend the obligation past the autumn. She had met Rue's kind before. The soft, well-fed, unfailingly pleasant man was the most dangerous kind there was, because he never raised his voice while he took the roof off over your head. He only regretted it, profusely, and signed his name. She squared the letters in a stack and laid her hand flat on top of them. "It's the note," she said, when Caleb came back in at noon. "Not the place. The place is sound. It's the note that's hanging you." He looked at her like a man who has been told the thing he already knew said out loud in a way that made it sound, for the first time, like it might be a thing that could be fought instead of only endured. He didn't answer. But that night he watched her a little differently across the supper table, and he did not put the ledger back up on the shelf in the soot. He left it on the table where she could reach it. The other thing came 2 days after, in fine clothes in the middle of the afternoon. Ruth was at the line with the wash when she heard the buggy and looked up and saw a man she had been waiting her whole life to see and had never once met. He was perhaps 40, and his coat was good black broadcloth, worn pointedly in a country of mended denim, and his hands when he stepped down were soft and pale as a banker's Sunday gloves, and he had a voice. She heard it before she heard the words of it, a voice that had been trained somewhere, patiently, over years, to sound reasonable while it robbed you. Augustus Thorne. He gave his name to Caleb on the step with his hat already in his hand and a smile already on, a smile that asked you to be ashamed of your own suspicion. And Caleb, who had no practice at refusing courtesy, brought him in and gave him the good chair. Ruth made coffee and served it, and she watched the whole of it from the still center of being a servant, which is the best place in the world to watch from, because the man in the good chair forgets you are in the room. Thorne forgot her. He took the cup from her hand without his eyes touching her face, the way a man takes a thing off a shelf, and that was the most useful thing he did all afternoon, because it told her exactly what he thought she was and exactly how much trouble he expected from that quarter, which was none. He priced her at nothing. She let herself be priced at nothing and stood back by the stove and listened to him do his work. He did it beautifully. He was sorry for Caleb's situation. The whole district was sorry. A good man brought low by weather no man could help. He was, as it happened, in a position to be of some use. He represented certain interests. He was vague and warm about the interests, the way a man is warm about a fog, interests willing to take troublesome acreage off the hands of hard-pressed men at a fair figure. More than fair, generous. A figure that would clear Mr. Hartwell's obligation to the bank entire and leave something over besides, enough to put the place on its feet. He was not interested in the good grass. He made a point of that, almost laughing. What would his people want with grass? He wanted only the bad acres. The played-out rock at the back, up the draw, the worthless ledge, the broken ground nothing would graze, the leavings of some old silver outfit that had dug there and gone broke. Surely Mr. Hartwell would be glad to be shut of dead ground that did him no good and only ate up his taxes. It was, Thorn said, almost a charity to a beaten man, and he said the word charity gently, and Caleb's jaw worked, because a proud man hears the word charity the way he hears a bell tolled for himself. Ruth stood by the stove with the coffee pot in her hand and her face as smooth as a stone in a creek, and inside her something went very cold and very clear and very still. She had known what the back acres were before she ever rode up the draw to confirm it. She knew, now, watching this soft man circle that gray ledge with his soft words, exactly what he was, and that the strange and terrible arithmetic of her own flight had set her down on the one ranch in the whole territory, where the two halves of her life were going to be forced together at a kitchen table. A man who only wanted grass did not ride out in his Sunday coat to buy the one stretch of a ruined ranch where nothing would graze. A man who only wanted grass did not circle rock. She filed it away with everything else she had filed away in her life, behind the still face, and she poured Thorn a second cup he had not asked for, so that she might stand near a moment longer and hear the shape of how he meant to take it. He left without an answer. He was too good at it to press for one. He left the offer hanging in the room like smoke, and a figure named that was more money than Caleb had seen at one time in 3 years, and the buggy went off down the rutted track trailing dust, and Caleb sat a long while with his hands open on his knees looking at nothing. That night, when the house was asleep, Ruth took the lamp and went out the back and up the draw alone, the way her father had taught her to go up aground, not looking where a fool looks but where the country tells you to look, at the float washed down in the gully bottoms, at the stain and color in the broken rock, at the way the ledge ran and pinched and widened. She knelt in the cold and turned pieces of it in the lamplight and saw the heft and the sheen of it, the gray-blue lead shine and the bright flecks the old outfit had been too green or too unlucky to follow. And she did not need the notebook to tell her. But she had read the notebook so many times she heard her father's dry voice reading it to her anyway. The assay he had run and recorded and never lived to file. A true silver lead vein, rich that the first men had quit just short of, in their ignorance, a few feet shy of the money. The same vein. The very same. She filled her apron pocket with 2 pieces of the float and went back down to the dark house and put them at the bottom of the trunk with the tin, and lay awake a long time with her heart going hard, because the thing she had run 1,000 miles to get away from had been sitting all along on the back 40 of the bed she now slept in. The town did not warm. She rode in with Jonas for stores and stood at the mercantile counter, while Agatha Pell weighed out her flour and her saleratus and her thread, and Agatha Pell priced her a penny high on every item, sliding the figures across the slate with a little smile that dared her to make something of it. A charge of a penny here and a penny there, the small mean tax a town lays on a woman it has decided not to like. Ruth counted the coins out exact and paid it without a word, and put the penny-high tally in the same place in her mind where she kept the bank letters and Thorn's soft hands, which was the long shelf of things remembered. She had a long memory and no temper to spend on a penny. She would settle Agatha Pell the only way that lasted, which was by outliving her contempt. The wool buyer she settled sooner. His name was Dorsey, and he came out the week after with a wagon to look at the clip. A fat-jowled man who had bought the Hartwell wool cheap for years on the simple ground that a man with the bank at his throat takes what he is offered. He pulled a fleece and squinted at it, and clucked over the season, and named a price 1/3 under what the clip was worth. And Caleb, beaten, opened his mouth to take it. Ruth, who had spent 2 of her hoarded postage stamps in a week of waiting, stepped out of the shed with 2 letters in her hand. They were answers, real answers, on real letterhead, from 2 rival buyers in 2 larger towns whom she had written to plain, stating the weight and the staple of the Hartwell clip and asking their figure by return mail. She did not raise her voice to Dorsey. She handed him the letters and let him read them and let him do the arithmetic on himself, and watched his face go through the slow understanding that the meek old maid the town had laughed at had quietly hung his own undercutting around his neck. He raised his price 1/3 on the spot, grumbling, to keep the clip from going down the road, and it was the first dollar in 3 years to come back into Caleb Hartwell's empty pocket, and it came back not by luck and not by charity, but by patience, and 2 postage stamps, and the willingness to make a man outfigure himself. Caleb stood holding the new figure and looked at her, and something moved behind his washed-out eyes that had not moved in a long while. The blizzard came at the worst of it, the way the bad ones always do, a brutal, freak, late spring storm that rode down off the high country in an afternoon when the lambs were dropping thick, a wall of white wind that buried the sage and the pens and turned the whole world to a roaring blind cold by full dark. Lambing in a blizzard is the thing that breaks ranches. A night of it can take a year's increase and leave a man with frozen heaps where his future was. Caleb went out into it the moment he smelled it coming, and Jonas with him, old and stooped, and were 3 young men in a storm. And they did not ask Ruth to come, and she did not wait to be asked. She came out into it on her own legs, wrapped in the dead woman's good coat off the peg, because it was the warmest thing in the house and there was no time to be tender about it. And she worked the whole black howling night beside the 2 men, and never once stood waiting to be told what to do. She waded the drifts and found ewes gone down in the lee of the pens and got them up. She carried newborn lambs slick and steaming inside her coat against her own body to the house and laid them in the warm by the open stove, a row of them, rubbing the life back into the small cold bodies with a sacking towel, while Sorrel, white-faced and brave, kept the fire fed and held the limp ones to her own small chest the way Ruth showed her, so that between the 3 of them in the kitchen and the 2 men in the storm, the dying was held off lamb by lamb through the worst hours of the dark. And in the gray middle of the night, she found the prize ewe, down in a drift at the far pen, the big sound ewe Jonas had pointed out to her the first day as the one that had been Mira's, the first and best of the line Caleb had meant to build the whole flock back from. And she got the half-frozen creature up against all its will and walked it stumbling to shelter and got its lamb breathing. And she did it without knowing yet what that one ewe meant, only that a living thing does not get to quit, while Ruth Calder has hold of it. Toward dawn the wind broke. It went off to the east the way a thing goes that has done what it came to do, and the cold clean light came up over a white country, and they took the count, the 3 of them gray-faced and crusted with ice, and the count held. They had lost a few. They had not lost the night. They had not lost the flock. And when Caleb came on the prize ewe alive in the pen, alive and on her feet with her lamb budding under her, Mira's ewe, the one he had not let himself hope for in the storm, Ruth saw the man's shoulders go, saw the iron thing in him that had stood 3 years of dying give all at once, and she did the kindest thing she knew how to do, which was to turn and busy herself hard at the gate latch, and give a hard man his moment with his back to her, and his face unwatched. When he had it back, he came and stood near her and said, "Lo," not looking at her either, "thank you." And then, lower, if she died, that ewe, I think something in me would have died with her. Ruth said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying, and the not saying was the whole of what she had to give him, and he took it. After that night the house was a different house, though neither of them named it. He let her ride the range bounds with him in the days that followed, the snow gone off in a wet warm rush, and he showed her the dwindling creek and the lay of his water, with the air of a man showing a thing to someone whose seeing of it mattered. And she rode it the way her father had taught her to ride a country, and saw in one swing of her eye a year round seep up in a fold of the high pasture that he had half forgotten and never valued, a cold true thread of water running clear out of the rock that she marked in her mind for later, for the saving of the place, the way she marked everything. Burl Tanner, the leather-faced old bachelor off the next range, who owed no man and feared no man, and had not so much as nodded to her in town, heard about the saved flock the way the country hears everything. And the next time their trails crossed on the road, he reined up and touched the brim of his hat to her. Just touched it, and rode on. And that small, grudging tip of an honest man's hat was the first crack in the wall the town had built around her, and she knew it for what it was. Thorn came back once more before the grass was fairly green. He was smoother, and he was more pointed, and this time he let a little of the iron show under the broadcloth, because charity that is refused too long turns into its true face soon enough. He named the thing plain that he had only circled before. The bank's note fell due in October. He knew the date as well as Caleb did, better. And when the bank foreclosed, when, he said, not if, Caleb would come away with nothing at all. The good grass and the bad rock together, the whole place gone under the hammer for the benefit of strangers. But if Mr. Hartwell were a sensible man, a man who thought of his child, he would sign over the worthless backtrack now, while the offer stood, clear the note, and keep his roof and his sheep and his daughter's home. Sign before October, said Augustus Thorne with his soft, sorry smile, or come away with nothing. And he left that hanging too, and drove off, and the dust of him hung gold in the evening light and would not settle. It worked on Caleb the way it was meant to. Ruth saw it working. She saw the man do the only sum a frightened father can do, and she watched the answer come up in his face over the next days, and she was not surprised when he came to find her in the lambing shed late one night, after Sorrel was abed, with a lantern in his hand and his hat off, and a look on him like a man come to confess. He stood in the lantern light among the warm breathing ewes, and he set it out. He meant to sign. He had thought it through every way there was, and there was no other way through. A man with a child could not gamble the roof over her head on his own pride, could not bet the only home that child had left in the world against the chance the rock was worth something more than a dead outfit had found in it, which was a chance no sane man would take. He would take Thorne's money, clear the bank, keep the grass and the sheep and the house. He would let the bad acres go. It was the only thing a sound man could do, and he was sorry, and he had thought she should hear it from him before he rode in and signed. And Ruth Calder stood in the lantern light among the sheep, with the whole of the truth crowded up hot behind her teeth, and nearly let it go. She had it all ready. The tin in the trunk, her father's hand in the notebook, the assay, the survey, the float in her apron, the name Augustus Thorne, and what that name had done on a dark trail 2 winters back, the whole of it, ready to be set down on the shearing bench between them and end his fear in a single breath. She had only to say it. And she did not say it. She did not say it because she had trusted the truth to a man once before. A man who had come to her father's door with soft hands and a reasonable voice, and her father had laid the truth out plain on the table for that man the way he laid out everything, honest as rock. And it had cost him his life, and cost her everything she had. And she had learned in the worst school there is that you do not hand a loaded thing to a man until you are certain of the man. She was not yet certain of Caleb Hartwell. She believed in him. The blizzard had taught her something, but believing is not certainty. And a combine that would kill an assayer would not stop at his daughter or at anyone she told. And she had no right to put this raw, grieving man and the grave little girl asleep in the house in the path of that. Not until she was sure. So she kept the truth behind her teeth one more time, where it sat like a coal, and she said only the one thing she could safely ask. "Don't sign yet." He looked at her. "Give me till the shearing's sold," she said. 1 month. Trust me 1 more month, Caleb, and don't put your name to anything that man brings you till the wool's off these sheep and in a buyer's wagon. That's all I ask. 1 month. And the man stood there a long moment in the lantern light, weighing the meek old maid the town had laughed at, who had read his ruin in an hour and come out into the blizzard and put the first $1 in 3 years back in his pocket. And against all the sense in him he found that he believed her over his own fear. 1 month, he said, and he gave it to her, and did not know what he had given, and went out of the shed into the dark, and Ruth stood among the warm sheep, with the coal of the truth still burning behind her teeth, and 1 month, now to make the truth safe enough to set down. The thing that broke her open was not Thorne, and was not the bank, and was not even Caleb saying he meant to sign. It was the child, on a still gray evening at the end of that month, with the lambs already grown leggy in the pens and the wind for once not blowing. Ruth was at the kitchen table with the ledger and a stub of pencil, and Cyril came and stood at her elbow the way she had taken to doing, watching the figures march down the page as though they were a kind of weather she could not yet read. Then, without being lifted, the girl climbed into Ruth's lap, which she had never once done, and settled there with her back against Ruth's front, and her small, cold hands folded over Ruth's wrist, pinning the pencil still. For a while she said nothing. Ruth did not move. She had learned that a quiet thing in this house, given room, would speak in its own time or not at all, and that the not at all was to be honored as much as the speaking. "Will we have to go away?" Cyril said at last, to the ledger and not to Ruth. "Pa thinks I'm asleep when he talks to Jonas, but I'm not. He said the bank man's going to take the place. He said come fall." She turned the folded hands over, studying them. "This is the only house I ever had. Mama's coat is on the peg. If we go away, do we take the peg?" Ruth's throat shut. She made herself breathe through it, slow, the way she had taught herself to breathe over a hot crucible when a wrong word or a shaking hand could spoil a whole day's assay. "We take the coat," she said. "Pegs you can always make new." The child accepted this, and then asked the other thing, the one that had been underneath all along, and asked it in the same flat, small voice she might have used to ask whether it would rain. "Will you go away too?" People go away. Mama went away. She did not say died. In this house, no one had taught her that the word died was a thing you could say out loud, and so she had built herself a gentler one, went away, and lived inside it. "If we leave the home, will you leave us, the way Mama left?" And there it was, laid plain on the table between Ruth's 2 hands like a sample of ore, the exact shape of what her caution had become. She had told herself for these weeks that to keep the tin shut was prudence, that she had trusted a hard truth to people once before, in the person of the men her father had thought were partners, and it had bought her father a fall on the trail dressed up as an accident, and bought her a flight west with a fortune in japanned tin and not a soul to tell. She had told herself she was guarding the notebook to guard herself, and that guarding herself was reasonable, because a combine that would kill an assayer would not balk at his daughter. All of that was true, and all of it she saw now with a child's two cold hands folded over her wrist, had quietly curdled into something that was no longer prudence. It had become the thing she despised most in the men of that town, a person sitting on what would save another and calling the sitting wisdom. She had watched Caleb decide to give up his roof. She had let him. She had held the rope behind her back and watched a good tired man reach for the cliff, because she was afraid of who he might tell. A woman who would do that to keep herself safe was a woman who had let the fear win all the way down, and Elias Calder had not raised his daughter at his elbow, taught her to read rock and run a fire and stand in a recorder's office and not be moved. To raise a coward. No, Ruth said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. I won't go away from you, Sorrel, not the bank's way and not your mother's way. Not while I've any say in it. That I can promise. The girl looked up at her then, the grave, wary eyes searching her face for the lie that grown people put on promises, and not finding it, leaned her head back against Ruth's collarbone and was, after a few minutes, asleep. Ruth sat holding the warm, sleeping weight of her until her arm went numb and her mind went clear and cold and certain. When Caleb came in from the pens, stamping his boots, smelling of lanolin and dust and the coming dark, she carried Sorrel to her cot and laid the quilt over her, and then she went to the trunk in the dead woman's room and took out, from the bottom, under the folded dresses, the locked tin she had carried 1,000 miles and never once set on a table where another person could see it. She brought it to the kitchen and set it down by the lamp. Caleb stopped with the coffee tin in his hand. He had seen the box exactly twice, the day she stepped off the stage and would not let him carry it, and never since. He knew the shape of it the way you know a thing that has been deliberately kept from you. He set the coffee down slowly. I have to tell you the truth now, Ruth said. All of it, and it's going to make you angry, and you'll have the right to be. Sit down, Caleb. This is going to take a while, and you're not going to want to hear the most of it standing up. He sat. She unlocked the tin with the small key she wore on a string under her dress and lifted out the field notebook. A fat, water-stained, leather-cornered book bristling with folded survey sheets and pinned in slips, the cover gone soft as cloth from handling, and she laid it open to the pages she could have recited in the dark, and she began at the beginning with her name. My name is Ruth Calder, and that part you have. What you don't have is whose daughter. My father was Elias Calder. He was a territorial assayer and a surveyor, a good one, the kind men sent for when they wanted the truth about a piece of ground instead of the answer they'd already paid for. My mother died when I was small, and he raised me himself, at the bench, at the fire, in the saddle with a chain and a transit. He had no son, and he made no apology for teaching a daughter what he'd have taught a son. I can run a fire assay, Caleb. I can cupel silver out of lead and weigh the bead and tell you to the ounce what a ton of rock will give. I can read a survey and walk it and tell you where the chains were stretched honest and where they were stretched to lie. I am not a hired wife who happens to keep good books. I am an assayer's whole education, walking around in a plain dress, and the world has never once guessed it, because the world looks at a 32-year-old spinster and stops looking. I have made a study of being stopped looking at. It has kept me alive. Caleb said nothing. His washed-out eyes had gone very still on her face. 2 winters back, she went on, my father was hired to come out to this district. This one, Caleb. This very district, and assay a piece of abandoned ground. An old silver outfit had dug there years before and quit and called it played out, and somebody wanted to know was it truly empty before they let it go for a song. So they sent the honest man. And the honest man went up the ledge and took his samples and ran his fires, and what he found was that the first outfit had quit a body length short. They'd chased the vein down a draw and lost it where it pinched and decided it was dead, and it wasn't dead, it had only stepped sideways the way veins do, and below the pinch it widened back out into a true silver lead vein. Rich, the real thing, the kind of strike that makes a district. He recorded every sample. He surveyed the whole of it. It's all here. She turned a page, and another, showing him the cramped honest columns, the assay values, the little folded map with its bearings and its hawk-herd ledge. He meant to file an honest claim and go to the people who held the surface and partner them fair, because that was the kind of man he was. He'd no more have robbed a homesteader of his own silver than he'd have salted a sample. He came home and he told me he'd found something that was going to set us up for life and set some plain ranching people up besides, and that he was going to ride in and file it inside the week. She closed the book over her finger. He never filed it. 3 days before he was to go in, his horse came home without him. They found him at the bottom of a cut bank on the Sweetwater Road with his neck broke and called it a fall. A careless fall, an aging man on a bad trail in the dark. Only my father had ridden that road 400 times sober in the dark, and he didn't drink, and his horse was the surest-footed thing in the territory. And the day after the burying, his office was gone through. Not robbed, gone through, papers turned, the strongbox sprung, by someone hunting one particular book and not finding it, because the one particular book was already sewn into my carpetbag. They wanted the notebook, Caleb. They knew what he'd found, because the men who'd hired the honest assay were the same men who decided, the moment they heard the answer, that they would rather kill the answer than pay for it. They wanted to take the ground for nothing through the land office, quiet, owner by owner, every homesteader signing away his worthless rock, and then own the silver free and clear with no honest assay on record to say they'd robbed anybody. My father was the one piece of paper that could ruin them. So they made him a fall on the trail. Caleb's hand had closed slowly into a fist on the tabletop. He still had not spoken. She made herself say the last of it. I knew where the book was, and I knew how to read it, and I was the only living soul who could do both, which made me the second piece of paper they'd have to burn. So I ran. I sold what I could, and I went west, and I kept going, and I learned that a single woman traveling alone gets remembered, and a married woman settled in a far district under a married name does not. When I saw your advertisement, a plain, hard-working wife, a working arrangement, a beaten man at the far edge of nowhere, I thought, there is a place no one will look for Elias Calder's daughter, because no one believes Elias Calder's daughter would marry a broke sheep man sight unseen. I came here to disappear, Caleb. I came here to hide a tin box and a dead man's word inside a plain marriage in a town too poor to matter to anyone. She drew a breath that shook in spite of her. And I want you to understand that I picked this place off a stranger's notice in a newspaper, by no plan and no knowing, and it landed me here. On your ranch. On these acres, because the played-out ground my father was murdered over, the abandoned silver outfit's worthless ledge that he proved was a true vein, Caleb, it's the bad acres. It's your back 40. It's the gray ledge running up the draw that you waved at the first evening and called nothing to graze it. That's the vein. That's my father's vein. I ran 1,000 miles from the men who killed him, and the strange arithmetic of grief set me down on the exact piece of dirt he died for. She watched it reach him. She watched him put it together in the slow, careful way he did everything. And then she watched his face change as the last stone dropped into place. "And Thorn," he said, the first words he'd spoken. His voice had gone rough and low. "Thorn keeps circling the back acres. Thorn keeps wanting the rock, not the grass. Augustus Thorn is the hand the syndicate sends ahead," Ruth said. "I didn't know his face when I came, but I know his work. And I knew it the first afternoon he sat in this kitchen and looked at the bad acres and didn't look at me. A man who only wants grass doesn't keep coming back for stone. He's the same combine, Caleb. The same Eastern money that hired my father and then killed him for the answer. He's been a year at it in this district, picking men off one at a time, dressing the robbery up as charity to the beaten. Clear your banknote and a little besides. Sign away your worthless rock. He bought up your paper. He's leaning on Burl and on the homestead men and on you. And the offer he made you, the kind offer, the church clothes offer, it's the same offer my father got. It ends the same way for anybody who's fool enough to be in his road once he's got the deed. The only reason you're alive to be cheated instead of killed outright is that you don't know what you're sitting on. I do. Which is why I'm worth killing and you're only worth swindling." For a long moment, Caleb did not move at all. Then he stood and went to the window and stood with his back to her, looking out at the dark where the lambing pens were. And when he turned around, she saw the anger plain on him, and she was glad of it, because a kind lie would have been worse. "You sat at this table," he said. "You sat right there, and you watched me hand you the Dunning letters, and you built me my own ruin in clean columns. And you knew the whole time there was a fortune in a box under my dead wife's dresses that would clear every dollar of it. You sat in that lambing shed not a fortnight ago, and you heard me tell you I meant to sign Thorn's paper. Sign away the very ground. Sign it to the man that killed your father. And you let me sit there and decide to do it, and you said, 'Don't sign yet, give me a month,' and you never told me why. You let me get that close to handing him the thing he murdered a man for. To handing it to him for the price of my own banknote." His voice cracked on it, and he mastered it. "That's a hard thing, Ruth. That's a hard, cold thing to do to a man who took you in." "It is," she said. She did not flinch from it. "It's the hardest thing I've done, and I'd give a good deal to have done it sooner. I can only tell you why, and you can weigh it. The last time my father trusted the truth to people who took him in, they put him at the bottom of a cut bank. I came to you a bought stranger. I had a child's safety to think of, and my own neck and a dead man's last word. And all I knew of you for certain was that you'd advertised for a hand and called it a wife, and told me on the porch the first night you'd not pretend it was anything it wasn't. I had no way to know, Caleb, whether telling you would buy us a future or buy us both a fall on the trail. A burned person is slow with a match. I was wrong to be that slow. I see that now. A child asked me tonight would I leave her the way her mother left, and I understood that I'd let being careful turn into being a coward, and that I was about to let a little girl lose the only house she's got rather than risk a truth I should have trusted to an honest man weeks ago. So here it is. All of it on the table. You can be as angry as you've a right to be. But the box is open now, and it stays open. The anger held in him a moment more, and then it went out of him the way a hard freeze goes out of the ground in spring, not all at once, but you could feel it giving. He looked at the open notebook on the table, and at her cool, steady hands resting on either side of it, and at the lamp, and at the door beyond which the child slept under her dead mother's quilt, and something in his shoulders came down that had been up since long before Ruth ever stepped off the stage. He crossed the room. He pulled out the chair and sat down again, close, and he reached out one rough, cracked hand and laid it over hers where it rested on the page. And he left it there, heavy and warm, and neither of them moved it. It was the first time he had touched her on purpose. The working arrangement, the contract, the thing they had both agreed to call it, it stopped in that moment being any of those words and became something neither of them said out loud because the saying would have been smaller than the thing. "All right," he said at last. "All right, Ruth. We're past the box now. Tell me what we do. Because I can't tell you what to do with a murdered man's notebook and a vein I always called nothing. This is your ground now, not just mine. So tell me, do we dig it?" "No," she said, and saw the surprise on him. "That's the first thing you have to understand, and it's the thing Thorne is counting on us being too greedy or too desperate to understand. We do not dig it. Not now, maybe not for a long while, maybe not us at all. The vein's real and it's rich, but it's locked in ground Thorne can still reach through the land office, and the day we sink a pick in it and the color comes up, every man that killed my father knows exactly where the daughter went, and they come for it the fast way and the bloody way instead of the slow paper way. A strike doesn't save us, Caleb. A strike kills us. The silver in the ground is not the prize. I've carried a fortune in a tin for 2 years and never spent $1 of it, and I'm not about to spend it now in a way that gets us all put at the bottom of a cut bank. The prize is the land held honest, and the swindle made impossible, and the men who did it brought into the open where paper and witnesses can finish them instead of guns. We don't win by getting rich. We win by making it so they can never get rich off us. And so the whole thing they've been quietly building falls down at once. And the way you make Thorne's scheme fall down at once is the same way you'd put out a grass fire. You take away the thing it has to spread. His whole scheme has to have one thing to live, and it's this. He has to pick us off one at a time. He has to get Burl alone, and you alone, and the Homestead men alone, each one signing his own worthless rock away in his own kitchen, none of them knowing the rest are signing too, none of them knowing the rock's not worthless. The day they stop being alone, the day they stand in one barn and look at one another and read in plain figures and plain rock what he's been doing, his whole year's patience is worth exactly nothing. Because there is no swindle in the world that survives the men it's robbing comparing notes. So that's where we start. Not at the ledge. At Burl Tanner's barn. We're going to make them stop being alone. Augustus Thorne came a last time on a cool, bright morning in the first week of October, when the cottonwoods along the creek had gone the color of beaten gold, and the high sage country lay quiet under a sky scrubbed clean of summer dust. He came not in the easy way he had come before, hat in hand and his voice oiled for church, but stiff in the saddle, 2 riders trailing him in town clothes that did not belong to country, and Ruth, hanging the wash on the line behind the gray timber house, saw the difference in him from a quarter-mile off and knew the season had turned all the way over. She did not hurry. She finished pinning the last of Sorrel's small frocks to the rope, dried her hands on her apron, and went in to tell Caleb that the thing they had been building toward all autumn had come to find them, and that they had better ride to town and meet it where the whole district could watch. For Del Marsh had done his quiet work, and the trap was not in the barn or the lambing shed, but in the open, where Ruth had decided from the start it would have to be. A swindle done in dark corners is undone in the light or not at all. Her father had taught her that with a survey chain in his hands, that the surest claim is the one any man can walk out and read for himself. So when Thorne reined up before the freshly painted land office in Coldwater Forks, he found not a beaten widower alone, but a gathering already drawn in. Burl Tanner leaning on the rail with his thumbs in his belt and his hat tipped back. The wavering homesteaders who had sat in his barn of an evening come in now in their good coats. Agatha Pell and half the town pretending to be about their errands and none of them moving on. And behind the recorder's counter, where the crooked clerk stood gray-faced, the young attorney Del Marsh, with a leather case fat with papers and the patient look of a man who has read every line of them twice. Thorne understood it slowly, the way a man understands cold water closing over his boots. He swung down, handed his reins to one of his town-suited men, and at last, for the first time in the whole long year of his patient circling, he looked at Ruth Calder properly. He looked at the plain, straight-backed woman in the gray dress, whom he had priced at nothing across Caleb Hartwell's kitchen table in the spring, whom he had not troubled to see because the world had taught him that such women were furniture. And something moved behind his soft, handsome face that was very close to fear. Recognition came into it, not of her he had never met her, but of the work, of the careful, unhurried, ruinous hand that had been taking his year apart joint by joint while he thought he was winning. "Mr. Thorne," Ruth said. Her voice carried easily in the still morning, pitched not to threaten but to be heard. "You've come for Caleb Hartwell's bad acres. I think it's time the whole town understood what you mean to do with worthless ground." He tried the reasonable voice. He was good at it. It had carried him a long way. He spoke of charity to a struggling man, of a fair price freely offered, of how a woman new to the country and tender of heart might mistake plain business for something darker. He spread his soft hands as though to show they held nothing. And Ruth let him finish, because she had learned that a swindler given enough rope will tie the knot himself, and when he was done she opened the japanned tin box on the recorder's counter and took out her father's field notebook, worn at the corners from 2 winters against her ribs, and laid it open in the light. "This is the hand of Elias Calder," she said, "territorial assayer and surveyor. Some of the older men here will remember the name. He was hired 2 winters past to walk an abandoned Silver Outfits ground out in this district and say whether it was played out, the way everyone said it was. He found it was not. He found a true silver lead vein the first operators quit a few feet short of, and he ran his samples and set his survey and wrote it all down here, meaning to file an honest claim and partner the men who owned the surface, not take it from them, partner them." She turned a page, and another, the close, careful columns of a working man's figures. "That ledge runs up the draw on the back of this ranch. The bad acres. The ground Mr. Thorne has spent a year trying to pry loose from one beaten homesteader after another for the price of a kindness." She did not raise her voice, and she did not soften it. She laid it all out as plain as a column of sums, the way her father had taught her that the truth ought to be laid out, so that a plain man could check every step of it himself, and need trust no one. The assay figures first, the ones any mining man in the crowd could carry up the draw and prove against the rock with his own hammer and his own fire if he doubted them. Then the survey lines, which Del Marsh now unrolled on the counter beside the worn notebook, copied true and witnessed from the recorder's own books, showing where the vein ran and exactly whose ground it ran under. Then the land office detachments, the quiet, lawyerly cuts that had carved the rocky backtracks off a dozen honest deeds one at a time, filed in the crooked clerk's own hand without the proper notice the law required, every last one of them. Marsh said in his clear, unhurried courtroom voice, void on its face for the irregularity, so that not a foot of that ground had ever truly left the men who farmed it. And then, last, the options. Thorne's own options, written in Thorne's own hand. The papers he had pressed across kitchen tables onto frightened men in lean winters, each one with its schedule of payments laid out fair seeming on the page, and each one lapsed now and dead, because Ruth had counted from the very beginning on a swindler's greed to make him cheap, and he had been cheap, and the schedules had run by unhonored while he squeezed and circled and waited for the bank to do his work for him. A man who will not pay $1 he can avoid, she had reckoned in the spring, will let his own paper die to save it. And so he had. You offered charity for worthless rock, Ruth said, and the rock was never worthless, and you knew it better than any man alive. That is not charity, Miss Thorne. That is fraud, named plain, and every man here you tried it on can read it now. And then she said the last thing, and she said it looking straight at him, in a voice gone quiet and level and old with grief held a long time. Ruth called Elias Calder's daughter. You may have heard the name. You had my father killed for what's written in this book, made it look like the trail took him, because he meant to file honest and you meant to take it for nothing. And you've been buying men's land for pennies ever since, so you could sell them back their own silver. I am the only one who knew where these notes were hid, and the only one left who can read them. And I have spent a year carrying my father's death against my ribs in a tin box. I am setting it down now, here, in front of everybody. The street was very still. The wind moved in the gold cottonwoods, and somewhere a windmill creaked, and that was all. Burl Tanner had come off the rail and stood square, and old Jonas Quick, who had driven Ruth and Caleb in and hung back by the wagon with his hat in his two-fingered hand, lifted his faded kind eyes to her with a look that was almost pride. The homesteaders had drawn close around the counter to see the figures with their own eyes, bending over the notebook, pointing, murmuring to one another the names of their own backtracks as they recognized them in the survey, and Ruth watched the thing happen that she had gambled the whole year on. She watched them understand, together, all at once, the slow tide of it moving from face to face, that Thorne's scheme had only ever worked by taking them one man at a time in the dark of a hard season, that each of them had thought himself alone and beaten and lucky to get charity for a worthless rock, and that the whole patient structure of it fell to pieces in a single morning the moment they stood in the open light shoulder to shoulder, and simply, quietly, refused. Silas Rue, the soft, well-fed banker, had come out of the bank to watch, and now wished he had not. For Marsh turned to him next, unhurried, and named the paper, the bad notes Rue had taken to finance Thorne's quiet buying, secured against ground Rue had been told was worthless, and had every reason to know was not. Rue's pleasant face went the color of tallow. He began at once, in front of everyone, to put distance between himself and the man beside him, to say he'd been deceived, he'd acted in good faith, he'd had no notion, and the haste of it, the unseemly scramble of a careful man to save his own skin, told the town everything it needed to know about how Silas Rue had meant to treat Caleb Hartwell come the autumn foreclosure he would now never get to call. Thorne tried once more. He had nothing left but the reasonable voice, and he reached for it the way a drowning man reaches for a board. Scales drift, he said. Surveys wander a chain or two. Assays are read high by hopeful men. A dead surveyor's private scribblings prove nothing a court would credit. This was a hard country, and accidents took good men on bad trails every season. And the woman's grief, however moving, was no evidence of anything but grief. He was smooth even then, even at the end, and Ruth gave him that much. He was the smoothest liar she had ever heard. and she had heard the men who got her father killed. But there was no purchase for it. The survey was recorded now. Square and witnessed 6 ways by Marsh. The assay her father had run 2 winters gone was confirmed in fresh figures by an honest mining man her father had once trusted. A man with no stake in Thorn and no reason to lie, whose independent report Marsh now laid on the counter beside Elias Calder's own. And the owners, the homesteaders, Burl Tanner, Caleb, stood together and would not be picked apart. And a swindle that needs men divided dies the instant they will not divide. Thorn looked from face to face for the soft one, the frightened one, the one he could still work, and there was not a soft face left in the street. Even Agatha Pell had folded her arms and set her jaw against him. So it ended the way Ruth had always meant it to end, without a shot, without blood, with paper and rock and people standing close. The fraud was a matter of record now, and so was the motive for Elias Calder's death, and Del Marsh had the machinery ready to send both to a real prosecutor in the territorial capital who had no love for the men Thorn worked for. There was nothing in Coldwater Forks for Augustus Thorn anymore but a noose tightening at his own pace. He gathered his town-suited men and his fine coat with what dignity he could carry, and the next eastbound stage took him out of the high country for good. Ruth stood in the street and watched the dust of him hang gold in the autumn light, and then thin, and then go all together as the wind took it. The way the wind in that country took everything that did not belong to it, and she found she felt no triumph at all, only a great quiet settling, like a thing set down at last that she had carried too far and too long. The threat came undone clean after that, the way a knot does once the right strand is pulled. The Hartwell note was cleared honestly through the New Wool Growers Association, the holdings pooled, Marsh's papers drawn so the land stayed in friendly hands instead of falling to Rue's bank, and the bank's whole leverage over the district fell apart in Rue's soft hands. The vein on the bad acres was opened in time, but on the owner's own lease and the owner's own terms, worked through the honest mining man her father had trusted, so the silver enriched the whole of Coldwater Forks rather than a syndicate back east. The Hartwell ground holding the heart of it, the broken ledge that Caleb had once dismissed with a tired man's contempt, now keeping a dozen families whole. And Ruth, who could have made herself rich digging, took her deepest payment in another coin entirely. That her father's name was cleared in the territorial record, that the men who had killed him would answer for it in a real court, that the long reach of the combine finally closed its fingers on nothing and died. The fortune in the tin she had carried so far and never spent a dollar of, she had never needed to spend it. She had only needed to refuse the lie and stand still in the light. That, in the end, was the whole of her father's hard knowledge, and she had used every grain of it. The rest came slowly, the way the true things in that country always came, not declared, but shown, over 100 ordinary mornings. Caleb's anger at her long silence eased the way frost eases off a window pane, a little more gone each day, until one evening over the books at the kitchen table, the lamp drawn close, he set down his pencil and told her the thing he had been carrying as long as she had carried hers. He'd sent for a hand, he said, not a wife. He'd written that advertisement with no notion of needing a person again, because the house after Mira died had filled up with a silence that had frightened him worse than the drought or the bank. And he had decided, the cold, deliberate way a beaten man decides things, simply never to let himself need anybody as long as he lived. And then, he said, not looking at her, turning the pencil over in his rough fingers, You went and made that impossible. You came out in the snow. You worked beside me all that night, and you saved Mira's ewe, and you never once asked me to thank you for it. A body can't go on not needing a person who'll do that. And Ruth, who had built herself a fortress of competence stone by stone across the worst years of her life, who had learned to want nothing she could not earn and trust no one she had not measured, found she could set her own grief down at last on that lamplit table beside the ledgers. She told him about the night her father did not come home, and the years after of carrying a fortune she could not spend and a truth she could not tell, and how she had walled herself up so high and so careful because she had trusted the truth to a man once, and it had cost her everything in the world. "You're the first person in a long time," she said, "I've opened the gate to. I didn't mean to. You made that impossible too." He put his hard hand over her cool one on the table, the way he had the night the tin box came open, and this time neither of them moved it. "It was always going to be you," Caleb said. "Marry me proper. Not the paper kind. It was you came out in the snow." And Ruth Calder, who had answered a stranger's advertisement to hide a fortune in a tin, said yes to the gray, faithful man as plainly as he had asked. They married truly the next spring, when the lambs were on the ground again and the sage had greened and the creek ran full from the snowmelt and the restored seep besides. Burl Tanner stood up for Caleb in a coat that had not seen daylight in 20 years, and Saurel walked ahead carrying wildflowers she had picked from the healing range, grave and proud, no longer asking at doorways whether everyone she loved would leave. Agatha Pell wept in the third pew and told anyone who would hold still that she had seen the quality in Mrs. Hartwell from the very first day, which was a lie everyone let her keep. And Silas Rue, much reduced and learning manners, took his hat clear off his head when Ruth passed, and held it there until she had gone by. The years that came after were the long good ones, the ordinary ones, the ones that turned out to have been the whole point all along, though nobody living them ever knows that at the time. The range healed under Ruth's careful rotation, and the water she had read in the ground that first golden evening, the overgrazed sage coming back thick and silver green where it had been worn to dust, the trickle in the creek swelling year on year as the ground learned to hold its snowmelt again. The broken windmill turned true on a mended vein. The good wool and the honest vein together made the Hartwell spread the soundest in the whole territory. And the prize ewe that had been Mira's, the one Ruth had saved against the stove through the blizzard night, threw lambs every spring until her line ran all through the flock, and a man could not look across the range without seeing her in it, though nobody who came to do business with the Hartwells would ever have guessed at any of their prosperity from the plainness of the gray timber house, or the plainness of the people in it, which was exactly as Ruth and Caleb both preferred. They raised Sorrel as their own, and Ruth taught her at her elbow the way Elias had taught Ruth, to read a ledger and to read a ledge, to run a fire assay and to run a survey, the true inheritance passing hand to hand down the years, worth more than the silver and harder to steal. And they had children of their own in time, and the first boy they named Elias. So the name went on in the country it had been taken from, spoken now by children at a supper table instead of carved on a far stone. Ruth used the new prosperity the way her father would have used it, in his spirit and not for his glory. She endowed a free school and an assay and reading room in Coldwater Forks, a plain stone building where any child or grown man could come and learn to read a page or a survey or a vein, and so never be priced at nothing by a smiling man who counted on their ignorance. She put no family name on it. It stands there yet, and the people who use it have mostly forgotten who built it, which was exactly what she wanted. She grew old on that healed range, and in the last gold light of her long life she came to understand the strange arithmetic of it all, that the worst thing that had ever happened to her, her father's murder, and the flight and the tin she could not spend, had been the very road, the only road, to the only happiness she had ever truly trusted. The fortune had never been the silver in the ground. It had been this, the plain, unrepeatable life built on top of it. The gray, faithful man, the grave child grown tall, the names going on, the great days that turned out to have been the ordinary ones all along, the mornings she had not known to count. She would not have traded a single one of them for every ounce of metal in the ledge. And the country settled at last into its rest. The flock moved white and slow across the green range in the evening. The seep ran clear over its stones the way it had before the drought, and would after them all. And the broken gray ledge up the draw, the bad acres, the curse, the fortune, lay quiet and honest in the hands of the people who lived on it, kept by them and keeping them in turn. The wind came down off the high sage country the way it always had. The way it had on the afternoon the stage set Ruth Calder down a stranger, with a locked tin held tight against her ribs, and it moved through the sage and over the healed ground and on across the wide gold evening, and it took nothing away with it that anyone there would ever miss.